Jesus taught, if we look at the life of Jesus, he taught to very large groups of people. There were a lot of people that would come and listen to Jesus teach, but he also had smaller groups around him. He had his 12 disciples, a much smaller group, that he called that followed him. And then even within that group of 12 disciples, he had 3 that were kind of formed his inner circle and really close to them. They were Peter, James, and John. And these 3, this small group of people, they got to witness even more than what the others got to. These are the 3 that were there when Jesus told Jairus' daughter to wake up. When she had died, and he comes and he saves her life. Those 3 are the ones that got to witness it. And today, those same 3 are going to get taken up to the top of a mountain with Jesus for what is known as the Transfiguration of Jesus. Transfigured means just being changed into something else. And we're going to dive into what that was about today and what we might be able to take from it. But this is what I want us to remember just about the Transfiguration itself. Jesus being transfigured reminds us we're being transformed. Jesus being transfigured reminds us we're being transformed. Again, transfiguration, he's being changed into something else. As followers of Jesus, we are being transformed and changed. So we're going to look at being changed and transformed by Jesus as we stay connected to him. We'll look at 4 different aspects of this story, and 2 of them are going to be from that mountaintop experience when they're up there with Jesus, and then 2 actually from the trip back down, which is every bit as much important as the first part. And we're going to see how they remind us who Jesus is and how we can grow in him. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 9. We're going to start with verse 2 today. It'll be up on the screen here behind me. It's bookmarked on the Bibles there in your tables. You want to follow along. Phones, tablets, computers, whatever you have is great. I will be in the NIV translation as usual. So here we go. We're going to start with Mark 9, verses 2 through 8. It says this: After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. All right, so they go up to the top of the mountain. And it says it's 6 days later. So prior to this, Jesus has explained what he's going to go through, that he's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, and he's going to death. So now he takes that inner circle, those 3, to the top of the mountain. And mountaintops are often times where there were big experiences and encounters with God. We see this back, Exodus 24. Moses is called up to the high mountaintop, and God's glory settles on it. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah goes to Horeb, which is the mountain of God, and meets God there. So Jesus takes the 3 up the mountain, and he's transfigured. He's changed into another form. He becomes so dazzling white, radiantly white, right? It says that his clothes were so white you couldn't bleach it out, right? No amount of Tide or Clorox or whatever they have cannot make him this white. He's glowing. And the radiance, this glistening, it's actually found in apocalyptic literature to denote the glory of the Messiah. So they're there. They see this. The disciples are being shown the future glory of Jesus. But Jesus isn't there alone. Elijah and Moses join him. These are 2 big figures from the Old Testament, okay? Very well known to Jews in Jesus' day. They are quite possibly there to represent the law and the prophets that Jesus comes to fulfill. Moses being the law, we have the law of Moses. Elijah, a big prophet from the Old Testament. Also, if we think in terms of how Mark writes, it could be showing that we have these 2 men of God who rejected earthly kingdoms and suffered for it, and then God vindicated them by bringing them to his glory. In Deuteronomy 34, it says, Moses died, but God buries him, and nobody actually knew where the grave was. So there's a thought, God just took Moses. 2 Kings 2, Elijah, it says, is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind by God. It's a pretty cool story. So we have these 2 men who spoke on behalf of God, talking with Jesus, who is the true revelation of God himself, right? Think about seeing legends of different generations of music or sports all come together and talk and hang out. That's what we have here. And Peter, never short on words, always has something to say, blurts out, "Let's make shelters for all 3 of you right here." He says it. He wants to prolong the glory that he sees, to keep this glory present. And maybe if they hold on to this glory, Jesus doesn't have to go the way of suffering. Because he told him about it last week. Peter didn't like it. And I understand where he's coming from, but it says he's frightened when he says it. This shows the idea comes from fear, not from faith. Faith would understand and accept that what Jesus said, that he needs to go the way of suffering and the way of the cross, is what has to happen. But Peter's fear, while understandable, is trying, again, to go in a different direction. And then we get the voice of God that comes in a cloud. God's voice often comes in a cloud. Again, Exodus and 1 Kings, we hear God's voice in a cloud. And he says, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." If any of that sounds familiar, we can think back to Mark 1, because these are very similar words to what the voice of God spoke to Jesus on his baptism when he said, "This is my son, in whom I am well pleased." But God also adds something here to the disciples. He says, listen to him, listen to Jesus. Biblical listening is not about something going in one ear and right out the other. It's obedient, it's active. It's hear what Jesus says and do it. So we get that voice of God saying, "This is my son, I love him, listen to him." And then it ends. An abrupt ending. Jesus is back, looking all normal, and the disciples got to be like, whoa. They had this mountaintop experience. So I want to pull two things out that we can take from this. And the first is look at the taste of the glory of God that we have. Peter, James, and John saw Jesus become radiantly glowing, transfigured right in front of them. They saw the glory. We need to understand the glory of God. Even though God hasn't fully brought his kingdom yet, he started to usher it in, and we have a taste of God's glory. I know that many of us here have Costco memberships, right? What's the best part about going to Costco? Everything. Samples, right? We went yesterday and we got samples. Stacy, Joella, and I. You go up and down the aisles, you find samples. You can borderline get a whole meal depending on how good they are. Yesterday was, I would call it average. It wasn't great. But it's strategic, right? They give you a little bit, and then what do they say? Oh, you can buy the whole box right over here. Or you can buy the whole package right over here. They got us with one yesterday. But for what? Right? So you buy the whole thing. They give you a little bit so that you get more. You get a little taste. See, we have yet to see God in his full glory. We get that when he returns. But we've got our Costco sample of Jesus' glory. We got that little bit. That's what his disciples got on the mountaintop. So I thought about this word glory as we're going to talk about it. I'm like, that's a real churchy word. So I looked it up. Zondervan Bible Dictionary says, glory is the worthiness of God, the presence of God in the fullness of his attributes in some place or everywhere. Okay, cool. What's that mean? All right. It means like we got God's attributes. We can see who God is in different places. So we're going to look at three attributes that I want to run through. First one is another really fun word called omniscience. If you need to know how to spell it, it spells like omniscience. That's how I wrote it. But what it means is God knows everything past, present, and future. God's everywhere and present at all time. God knows it all. We can't hide from God. We can't be somewhere where God can't find us. And not being able to hide from God might make you go, there's times where I really just want to curl up and hide from him in my closet because of what's happened. But it's a good thing, because while he can see all of us and always find us, even the parts we don't want him to see, we get to see him as well. Because we need that continuous and constant presence of God. We need the conviction God gives to not do something. We need the direction to know where to go when we have no idea which way to turn. We need the comfort of his presence to know we're not alone. Now, I know sometimes being alone sounds great. Alone time is great, especially those of those kids know, man, that 10 minutes alone time is great. But being alone on itself is not, because that's when the thoughts and the temptations that take us away from God can creep in. So take your alone time for whatever you need, but know you're not alone because we're supported, cared for, and guided by God. We need that no matter what. God's also self-sufficient. This isn't one I feel like we talk about a lot, but I like it. So we're going to do it today. He's self-sufficient. God doesn't need anything or anyone. Think about that. God doesn't need us. He doesn't. But he wants us, and he chooses us. Our God that's strong enough and authoritative enough, smart enough to do anything with the flick of a finger wants us and chooses us to be around him. He wants us to have community with him. There is nothing we can do to enhance God or make him better. But God can enhance us and make us better. All God asks in return is to give him our worship and devotion, not to make him feel better, but it's in response to him making us into better versions of ourselves, the versions he created us to be. So God doesn't need us, but he wants us and he chooses us to be with him. And then love. God doesn't just give or show love. God is the literal embodiment of love. There's some good stuff in that on 1 John 4 if you want to look at that. But God is love. Everything God does comes from a place of love. And this isn't just an emotional, Valentine's Day, anniversary, tears of joy kind of love. That's part of it. That's not it. Because with God, every action he takes, everything he does is out of love because he is love. It might come out in gentleness and comfort. It might come out in truth and justice. It might come out in conviction. But it all comes from a place of love. And God being love also means it is an unending and never failing love because God doesn't end or fail. Our love for other people will fail. We will screw up and not treat someone out of love at times because we're human. But God can't do it because he's love and can only act in love. God is the literal manual or playbook for love. When we think we don't know how to love someone or we can't love someone, we look to God because he is the source of love, shows us how we can love even those toughest to love. So often I find it's not so much that I don't know how to love someone, it's I don't want to love them. I don't feel like loving them. But that doesn't cut it with God. It seems like it's hard to do, right? We have this conversation with our kids many times about you can do hard things. It's not too hard. You can do it. You can try it. You can do hard things. Well, we're God's kids, and we can do hard things. Some of that is loving people, especially the ones we don't want to love or that are really hard to love. And we do it by looking at God as a source and example of love. We see God. We see him as love, and we see it in his glory. So we recognize and see God in all his glory, and we let that show. So they learned that because they saw that future piece of God's glory when Jesus was transfigured. But then God speaks to the three, and he says, listen to them. So we need to listen to Jesus. That voice of God, it comes in the clouds, and it implores the three disciples, listen to him. Listen, hear, take it in, be obedient to what they heard. Back in 6th grade, I remember having to take what amounted to like a home ec class. I don't know if they still do classes like that anymore. Basically to learn the basics of cooking. Okay, and one day, it was all about just learning how to read a recipe. So a teacher gives us a recipe, but it wasn't like for food, it was just stuff to do around the classroom. And we're going through it, we're reading it, and at some point everybody's jumping up and down or doing a push-up, high-fiving the teacher, spinning in circles, all these things that are on it. But then you get to the last instruction, and it just says, put your name on this and give it to the teacher. Well, if you go back to right underneath your name, it says read all directions first. Read all directions first. You had to do that test? Yeah. We should give that test still because it's good. We didn't have to do any of it if we had read the whole thing and listened to that first instruction. Listen to Jesus. When God came in the cloud, he said, listen, listen well. We also need to listen. Here's the thing. In order to listen to God, we have to listen for God. Listening for God takes an openness and making space for his voice, taking time to hear it. Break the distractions and the noise, even if just for a little bit, to allow yourself to listen for God. Turn the radio off on the commute to work. Get up 10 minutes earlier than normal. Take a walk with no earbuds in. Take some time before bed before you start scrolling through everything in all your reels, something like that. Daily time that doesn't have to be super long, just make it consistent. Time to just open yourself up and start to listen for God, because the more consistent we make our time listening for God, the easier it becomes to recognize the voice of God when it does come. And then we can listen to God. Listen when God talks to you about you. God will talk to you about you. God's the Father who loves to talk to his kids about them. The good things you're doing, when he gives you the well done, good and faithful servant, you're doing well. God will tell you that. But then he's going to tell you, what do you need to improve on? Where can we clean some things up? Maybe you missed here, or your heart wasn't in the right place here, or you know what, I saw you trip up. Let me help you up, clean you up, and let's try not to trip next time. And then we respond in obedience. That's part of listening. We keep going. When he does the well done, good and faithful servant, he says, keep going there. We keep going where there's momentum. Or then if there's something wrong, if there's a problem, we identify what we need to change. And that's where we take a pause with God. I was in a training this week, and the presenter was talking about organizational change, so a little different context, but it fits here with this too. And he said, generally, when something goes wrong, the prevailing thought is to just keep going and just work harder, and it'll get better. And he's like, it's wrong. Because trying harder doesn't always work when what's needed is a change. Right? You can't out-try needing a change. So we take a pause. If there's something in our lives that needs to change, we take a pause with Jesus, we slow down, and we let him show us what needs to change, and then how to go about that change. Let him teach us how to do it. We just have to listen for Jesus and listen to Jesus when he reveals that to us. And then we listen when God talks about himself. God does like to talk about himself. He's not arrogant or selfish, but he talks about himself in a way to reveal more of himself to us, and that's a benefit to us. The 3 disciples on the mountain needed to listen to Jesus so they would learn what type of Messiah he was truly going to be and what he needed to do to accomplish his mission. They had to correct some assumptions. We need to hear from God to correct our assumptions about him. We need to hear from God to let him tell us, hey, I was here in that situation with you, or I was in that conversation with you even if you didn't know it. We need to hear from God for him to tell us, here's how I might have shown grace here when you didn't, or how to love somebody. We need to hear God talk about himself also. Because we need to hear God talk about himself so we learn more about him so we can live more like him. So we listen for God, we listen to God, and we live more like him. And we get all that from that mountaintop experience the disciples had. But then they come down the mountain. Let's read about that. Mark 9, 9 through 13. Now they're going to come down the mountain. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected. But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. So now they're coming down the mountain, and Jesus actually gives a very familiar instruction. Don't talk about what you've seen. Now, if you've been with us, this is a very familiar instruction, and Jesus has said this multiple times. At this point, I'd be like, Jesus, I get it. You don't want us to talk about it, but at some point, we got to talk about it, right? Finally, Jesus gives them a when. He says, don't talk about it until the Son of Man has risen. Talk about it after Jesus has been raised from the dead, after he's done what he's out here claiming he's going to do. See the reality of Jesus and the resurrection, and then be a witness to it. Per usual, the disciples are confused. Totally normal. They get the concept of the resurrection of the dead, because that's common in their thinking. God raising people from their tombs. But the idea of just this resurrection of the Son of Man, something totally independent of the resurrection they know about, they can't come to grips with it. Right? And it ties back to their thinking, why does Jesus need to suffer? He shouldn't have to, and they still can't wrap their heads around it. So they go back to what they've been taught. They're like, wait a minute, but Elijah's supposed to come first and restore all things, right? So maybe Elijah's still going to come back, he'll make all things right, and then Jesus doesn't have to suffer. Sounds great. And Jesus is like, well, you got the order right. Elijah's going to come back first, and indeed he already has. What Jesus is referring to is John the Baptist, John being the second coming of Elijah. See, John announced Jesus in the wilderness, called people to a baptism of repentance. There's our restoration. He ran afoul of earthly kingdoms, and he was punished. Go back. He called out Herod and Herodias for how they were living. They didn't like it. He eventually gets beheaded. We talked about that story in Mark 6. That all happened, but it doesn't negate the fact that Jesus had to go the way of suffering. That's what they got coming down the mountain. Jesus had to suffer. He confirms he still has to go the way of suffering. It's the way it has to be, even if it involves pain or suffering. I often talk about fitness and lifting weights and all that good stuff because I like to be fit. Ryan, Eugene, and I text each other our workouts throughout the week, and we just respond with like the bicep flex emoji because we're really cool like that. Literally, that's our whole text thread. But we lift weights. Why? To grow muscle and get stronger. But lifting weights isn't what actually produces the muscle, is it? According to Medical News Today, lifting weights causes the muscle fibers to tear or damage. Then the body, while resting, repairs them, fusing the fibers back together, leading to muscle growth. The muscles go through tearing and some pain. That's a really good pain, though. Waking up sore after a workout, love it. Y'all think I'm weird, that's fine. I still like it. You can think I'm weird for whatever you want. That's fine. You got to be a little weird to be a pastor, I'm just going to be honest. But it goes in order to get that muscle growth, it goes through pain and suffering. Jesus had to go the way of pain and suffering to get to his glory. All proof Jesus would have been a gym bro. Okay? That's a joke. Please don't quote that. But he had to go the way of suffering. That's true. That's biblical. So we have to recognize what it meant that Jesus had to suffer. Jesus had to take on suffering to pay for the suffering of his people. God's people suffered, and we were destined to suffer if our sin wasn't paid for, and Jesus took that on. He's known as the suffering servant. His suffering shows an investment in us. It shows how much he cares. He's about us. He's for us all the way to the cross and to the grave. And he doesn't ask us to repay him for it because we can't. He just says, follow him. Follow his way. We talked last week about the different ways we can stray from following Jesus. And it's tempting, knowing that following Jesus in the way of suffering might lead us to some type of suffering and hardship and pain. Because we aren't promised that following Jesus will be easy. It certainly wasn't easy for Jesus what he went through. But following Jesus, even if it includes some level of suffering, is worth it. And it's worth it because if we look at where it leads, all because Jesus suffered first. He suffered first, shouldered the cross, went to the grave. We shoulder the cross, we may go through suffering and hardship, we end up in heaven. We end up with Jesus. Following Jesus' suffering leads to the place where there is no more suffering. Without Jesus, without the suffering of Jesus, we have eternal suffering. Because Jesus suffered, we have eternal community with him. He suffered and died. He had to. But then he rose. On the way back down the mountain, Jesus finally tells Peter, James, and John when they could talk about him being the Messiah, and it was after the resurrection. After he'd gone the way of rejection and suffering and surrender. He had to do things his way, but then they could talk about it. Then they got to be witnesses, honest witnesses to the resurrection, which is important. A few years ago, I pulled the great civic responsibility of jury duty, which some of you I know have had. And I actually got selected to serve on the jury, and it was a 2-day trial, so I'm up in the box doing this whole thing. And the prosecution called a number of witnesses, but I remember thinking and talking with one of the guys in the deliberation room, these witnesses are pretty terrible for the prosecution. Like, they didn't help. I'm listening to it, I'm like, they're going seemingly against what would have helped their case. They didn't seem to testify to things that actually helped the prosecution. So it's kind of this weird thing. We need to be good and honest witnesses to Jesus that will help the kingdom grow. We don't want to be witnesses or testify in a way that doesn't help Jesus. Because it's okay for us to talk about Jesus. It's okay for us to live about Jesus. It's okay for us to testify about Jesus now. But to do that, think about who are we really testifying about? And it's Jesus, obviously. But it's the Jesus of the Bible. The true Jesus, the Savior. It's not the Jesus that maybe we've created or that we've assumed. That's why Jesus has the disciples wait. Because they had these human assumptions and ideas about what the Messiah would be. Jesus wanted and needed them to see who he truly was. We can't testify to the Jesus we want or the Jesus that we create. He's not the Republican Jesus. He's not the Democratic Jesus. Not the American Jesus. He's not the country music Jesus. He's not the social media Jesus. He's the biblical Jesus, the Son of God, and the true Jesus. What happens is we try to fit Jesus into this mold that we make and forget that Jesus is the one actually molding us. We know who Jesus is. We have our Bibles. We can read about it. It's there. We just have to come at it without assumptions, without our own ideas, and just see the Jesus that God sent for us. That's the Jesus we testify about. The Jesus that was about love and compassion and truth and justice and all of those things by his definition of those words. There are people out there that have no clue who Jesus is or what he's about. Testify to them about Jesus. Show them, talk to them. They need to know the real Jesus. Show and testify about Jesus to people in a way that maybe sets them straight. There are people that have obscured who Jesus is. There are people that have blatantly made Jesus into something he's not. There's a story in Mark that we're going to get to in a little while in Mark chapter 11. But it's about Jesus going into the courts. And the temple courts have become a marketplace with money changers. And Jesus is not happy. Jesus famously gets righteously pissed and starts flipping over the tables and saying, "You've turned this into a den of thieves." Because, oh, there goes my coffee. Caught it. Nailed it. Ooh. They had turned the temple into something it wasn't. See, unfortunately, there are people out there that have turned Jesus into something he isn't. They use his name or his image in a way that's opposite of who Jesus is. They use Jesus to testify to their own opinion rather than testifying about Jesus himself. They might need to, in a way, have their tables flipped over. And I'm not saying go out and pick a fight, but stand up for the Jesus who is. And we can do that because we have the example and the stories of who Jesus is. We have the power of the Holy Spirit continuing to reveal who Jesus is to us. See, we know, we serve, we worship, we testify to the true and risen Jesus. And we can do that and continue to do that because Jesus is continually transforming us every day. We're being transformed, and we'll wrap up with this. The Transfiguration reminds us we're being transformed and that Jesus will come in glory. We have a taste of it. Remember that he's everywhere and everything. He's self-sufficient. We have his love. Those things should change us, transform us in how we act. And we need to listen to Jesus. God told the disciples to listen. We need to do the same. We have to listen for Jesus. We have to listen to Jesus. And remember, he had to suffer. I don't know for you if that's a hard part to grasp or not, but he had to go through the suffering for us. And we may go through hardships or our own suffering while following him, but the end is still heaven and community with him. And then we testify to that risen Jesus. Be an honest and awesome witness of the true Jesus. Not the Jesus that fits your own narrative, not the Jesus that's convenient, but the Jesus of the Bible. Let others know about him. Be transformed by all that Jesus is. Let's pray. God, I thank you for today. And God, I thank you that you're transforming us, that you're changing us daily. God, I just pray that we would allow that change to happen. Whatever it is, if it's a small part of our lives or a big part of our lives, God, that we would just open up to you, that we would take a pause to listen for you and listen to you about what that is in our lives. If it's the way we view you or the way we view others, the way we act, the way we talk, the way we behave, God, whatever it is, pray that you would show that to us. God, I pray that you would put it loudly on all of us today and this week. God, make it so obvious where you are in our lives and what we need from you and where we need to see you more. So God, I thank you again that you are the God that will change us and change us for the better. We thank you again for meeting us here this morning, God, in your name. Amen.